Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June Teaching and Learning for Student Success monthly webinar series. This is the first in our summer 2017 webinar series. During the summer, because so many people are typically on break, we do often just feature our Catch the Next staff, and today my webinar will be about resources for your culturally relevant curriculum. And of course, I am the Director of Teaching and Learning for Student Success Peer Mentoring Program, Lydia French. And without further ado, I will go ahead and just get started. So I wanted to go over some items that we talked about that Dr. Rafael Castillo and I spoke about in our presentation during the 2017 Catch the Next Summer Institute, which we just concluded last week. The first thing is that cultural relevance has multiple meanings, and the title of our presentation at that time, of course, was Defining Cultural Relevance. If you look at your handouts section in your webinar pane, there are 5 handouts there, and one of them is Gloria Ladson-Billings' 1995 article about that really establishes the theory of cultural relevance. And what she discusses is that basically cultural relevance for her is kind of more of an orientation towards teaching. So she's looking at culturally relevant pedagogy and philosophies, pedagogical philosophies more generally. And it's an orientation toward both teaching and education, as well as toward the social structure of the classroom. So it's one that doesn't take for granted a top-down structure of curriculum or a top-down teaching practice. It's one that decenters the classroom and sees the students as contributors to knowledge building in the classroom. And it's also one that she points out encourages both teachers and students to sort of question curricula as they come down. And so that's definitely a theoretical article that I would suggest if you haven't taken a look at it already. Another document that you have in your handouts, and for those of you who attended the 2017 Summer Institute, these are included in your binder, so no need to download these or print them. They're already in your binder after tab 2. But this is from Freeman and Freeman, Personalizing Literacy. And they really point out that culturally relevant materials are ones that connect to students' lives, not just to their cultural heritage. And as we were kind of, in our Summer Institute presentation, as we were sort of trying to demythologize the idea of cultural relevance, one of the ideas that came up is this idea of just a pan-culturalism or multiculturalism that tends to substitute for cultural relevance. And so it's really important to recognize that cultural relevance, especially in terms of the texts and materials that you incorporate into your classroom, we don't want to make assumptions about the students either in terms of race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or religion. And so it's important to select materials that relate to their lives and again that are relevant to them and that will also help them grow, but also materials that in which they will sort of see themselves reflected, and that's the tension that we have to negotiate. So Freeman and Freeman ask a few questions that kind of get to the heart of how they decide. It's kind of like a rubric for how they decide whether or not a text is culturally relevant. First, they ask, are the characters in the story like you and your family? And these are certainly questions that you can ask yourself as you're designing your syllabus and as you're designing your curriculum, but they're also questions that you can ask the students. So are the characters in the story like you and your family? Have you ever had an experience like one described in the story? Have you lived in or visited places like those in the story? Could this story take place this year? So it has to do with sort of, generational relevance and things like that. How close do you think the main characters are to you in age? Are the main characters in the story boys or girls? Do the characters talk like you and your family do? It's getting to the heart of language, of course. And how often do you read stories like these? So those are Freeman and Freeman's set of questions that sort of judging a book's cultural relevance or judging a material's cultural relevance. In addition to the presentation that Dr. Castillo and I gave, we also had, of course, several presentations or several ideas from Dr. Laura Rendon, another of our peer mentors, who presented on her validation theory as well as her idea of senti pensante as a way of a contemplative pedagogy. And so some of the ideas that she suggested as a form, especially of senti pensante, but also as a form of contemplative pedagogy that does validate students in terms of where they come from. And the first was slam poetry. And actually, at the end of the week, last week, we had a slam poet who's another one of our peer mentors, Mike Gwynn from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he, in our transfer motivational conference, where we had students, most of whom were finishing up their first year in the program, he actually gave them a couple of writing prompts and asked them to write a poem. They had about an hour or so to write it, and then they had a little bit of a break to practice it. And then we actually had a whole slam poetry session, and it was really incredible. And the students, I was blown away by what they could do in such a short amount of time. And it evoked a lot of emotion and was really fun, and they enjoyed it. So I would say that this is something that you could definitely do. Either in the EDUC class or in the English class as well. Dr. Rendon also spoke about the Cajita project, and another of the handouts in your handout section that you have is an overview of this project. But the idea is, so a caja is a box, a cajita is a little box, and the idea is that the students would design and create a cajita that represents them and something about their identity. This is a great way, thinking about identity and asking students to create materials, whether they're written or performed or multimedia projects or like this sort of more physical projects that represent their identities is a great way for you to understand where they're coming from, but also for them to understand for them to start to understand how they fit into the classroom, to the college, to the curriculum, and all of those sorts of things. Most of us already do this already, but another engaging way to validate students and to get them to connect with the material, of course, is to employ video, music, and photos in the classroom. Those kind of multimedia techniques bring the material to life often in ways that allow students to more easily engage with strictly text materials. And then some other possible assignment ideas include autoethnographies, where students are writing about themselves in the context of their culture. Autoethnographies are something that I've done with my students, both in Composition 1 and in my humanities ethnic studies classes. And I will share with you if you're interested. Basically, I have a set of questions that the students have to ask as kind of their brainstorming for the assignment, and then they take it all and craft it into an essay. So again, this is something that with your learning frameworks partners, maybe the students can begin answering the questions in the learning frameworks class, and then kind of more deeply engage in the writing process in the English class. But the first question is about how you identify culturally. And I focus on the fact that you know, culture means more than race and ethnicity. So I have students who say, I'm a Texan. I have students who say, I'm a human. You know, I don't see distinctions. So, um, and then the second question, and these first two questions, they all have to answer. The second question is, when did you first learn or tell the story of the first time you understood cultural difference or cultural belonging? And this is where students really start to get into the heart of it. And it's usually right around kindergarten when there's like 5, 6, 7 years old. That they, you know, they tell stories of their first recognition of the time that they realized they didn't fit in, or their first recognition of the time that they belonged in a certain space, or they, you know, they felt really at home in a certain space. And then after that, I ask them to describe things like their neighborhood or barrio or ward, their state, nation, and their sense of belonging to that. I ask them to describe different aspects of language. What are their home languages versus what are their, you know, sort of business languages and school languages and things like that. Um, what else? There's a set of about 7 different questions that I ask them. Oh, of course, about food, religion, gender identification, and gender roles in their culture. And so the first 2 questions, all the students have to answer, and the second set of, I think it's about 7 questions, they can pick from among those which ones are most relevant to them and the story they want to tell. So I start with that, and then the second part to it is that they choose people from their community who they want to interview. And that kind of leads into the next 2, which is oral histories or community or mentor interviews. And these are assignments that you can really incorporate across the curriculum, especially thinking about the role of mentoring in and preparing students for the mentoring relationship in the learning frameworks class, for instance. But also, I know we have some Mathways folks now as well. So one of the assignments that I can get into a little bit more later that came up as we were discussing various ways to contextualize the math classes was this idea of career research and asking students to think about how much math, you know, what their career trajectory is, what are their career goals, and then finding out, doing some research into how much math and what kind of math they're going to need to do for that job. So mentors might be, you know, a critical resource for that, but also finding community members who are already in that field and maybe asking students to interview them as well. And then finally, this was one just mentioned on Dr. Rendon's slide, but I wanted to bring it up because it's something that I've done really effectively in the past with students, and that is digital storytelling. So in the digital storytelling process, you really kind of go through the writing process, the creative process, but the ultimate production is a video, about a 3-minute long video that incorporates photos, which is something that we use already in the Catch the Next curriculum. So it incorporates photos, students write a narrative voiceover, and that is recorded. So it incorporates writing as well. And then it's all put together with the photos and the stories. So if you'd like, I can share with you some of my students' digital stories. You know, a lot of times I'll ask them to pick the theme. They get to select the theme. I've done it in both Composition 1 and Composition 2, where in the second semester of composition, it was a more, it had to be a more persuasive piece, and so it was almost kind of like the students were like making an ad or something, but they did it really, really effectively and incorporating their research. So that can be another thing. And again, because it is a time-intensive activity, the digital storytelling, and you also do need certain resources to be able to conduct it. I would say that this is something that could really effectively be a shared project among all of the Dreamcatchers Pathway classes. And so this is a really good way to integrate assignments across the curriculum. Okay. So I want to move now to the fifth and last. Oh, I didn't talk about one of the handouts, which is Laura Rendon's kind of her testimonial, kind of her history and her story from as she, went from the barrio to the university. And so that's a handout that you have. And then the fifth handout that you have is an a bibliography that's partially annotated. So I wanted to just go over some of the texts from that bibliography here. These are just selected texts, and the first one I wanted to talk about is Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi. You can see mine is really well used. The subtitle is How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do. And Steele is an African-American social psychologist. The title of this book comes actually from Brent Staples' essay, or I think it was an article originally published in, I believe, Harper's in the 1980s. And Staples is talking about, the original title is A Black Man's Power to Alter Public Space. And he's talking about basically just the sense he gets, the recognition he has of the way in which a space changes and how people react to him just by his very presence because he's an African American male. And so he tells various stories of his experience and how he's been stereotyped as an African American male. And at the very end of it, he starts explaining some ways that he has been able to kind of moderate or ameliorate these stereotypes and his impact on public space. And one of the things he does is he whistles Beatles tunes or he whistles Vivaldi. And he finds that there's something about, whistling classical music that it somehow diminishes people's fear of him as a Black man. So Steele is taking this idea of stereotypes and he applies it to a wide swath of various identities that he calls social identities. One of the things I really like about this book, and I have taught it in the integrated reading and writing class, so it's extremely high level. It is a social psychology text, but Steele introduces terms, psychology terms, and explains them in a way that is really engaging. And it does take some unpacking with the students, but at the end of the day, they get it. And one of the ways they get it is because they're able to share their own experiences. So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this book up in particular, and it's a book that talks about stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is not the threat of being stereotyped. Stereotype threat is, like with Brent Staples, is the recognition that just because I embody some specific social identity, I know that people think of me in a certain way, right? And that is a way that accords with certain stereotypes. So for instance, he talks about women and math, the stereotype that women are bad at math. He talks about the stereotype that Asians are good at math. He talks about stereotypes relating to whites and blacks as, in athletics. And basically he reviews various social psychology experiments that he has conducted and demonstrates that stereotype threat, just that awareness that there's a stereotype somewhere out there in the air about us. The stereotype threat has an impact on our ability, our physical and mental capability to complete certain tasks, because it creates anxiety, heart palpitations, stress, all of this added stress, this idea that we need to work twice as hard as everybody else and things like that. Students completely relate to this, and they relate to it on the level of education as well. And so one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up during the webinar is because in Dr. Castillo's and my presentation, we asked about what first comes to mind, kind of the association game. What comes to mind, positive and negative, when you think of cultural relevance in your curriculum? And one of the negative comments, actually, I think it came up a couple of times, that arose was, or that emerged from that activity, was this fear that instructors have, a very real and valid fear, I think, of stereotyping their students or making assumptions about their students. That, for instance, just because you have 90% Latino students, that, would it be racist? Would it be stereotyping to have an all Latino curriculum? And so I think that is a very valid fear. It's one that I've seen and heard expressed multiple times, and instructors have, various fear management strategies for dealing with that. And one of those strategies is to include just a broad multicultural curriculum. So I include this book because it's a way of addressing stereotype head on. You don't have to worry about stereotyping your students with this book because they will tell you what stereotypes they have encountered. And again, this is the idea with cultural relevance, is that you begin with asking the students, not making assumptions about what they know or who you think they are or what their experiences are. You give them opportunities to bring their prior experience and their prior knowledge into the classroom. So one of the activities that we do with this to get started thinking about it and to get started writing about it is I'll have students create a T-chart where on the one side they'll list all of their social identities. And you get some really interesting ones that you wouldn't think would count as social identities. Like I had a student previously who had been adopted, and she put that as her social identity, and that was the one she selected. So you have them list all their social identities, and then they pick one, and then on the other side of the T-chart, they will make a list of stereotypes that they know are associated with that identity. And then they can free write on a very, an experience they've had with stereotype threat with that specific identity. So it's a way of learning a lot about your students, which can then help you, really meet them where they are and validate them and recognize the assets that they bring into the class. So again, I highly recommend this book. And also students feel really accomplished when they finish reading this book. I assign the entire thing. I think there's only maybe 2 chapters that I don't assign. And they feel really accomplished when they get it, because these ideas are really tough. Steele also has various videos on YouTube. So if you just go on YouTube and search for Claude Steele, there are videos ranging in time frame from 2.5 minutes all the way up to like over an hour. So you can also select from those and use those to complement the text. Another book that I wanted to include, and again this is from the bibliography, is Jose Antonio Burciaga's Drink Cultura Chicanismo. I include this one because I have found that students get really, really excited about it. And again, Chicano students get excited about it, Latino students get excited about it, but also I've never encountered a student of any cultural background that has not liked this book. And I'm teaching it right now, and I got an email from a student. It's one of the first they read selections from it as one of the first texts for the semester. And this is from my summer course, actually. She wrote me an email to say, this is within the first week of the class, just wanted to let you know how much I enjoy reading Drink Cultura. I've introduced it to my boyfriend, who I can say can't put it down. I don't think I've ever had a required reading that I've wanted to add to my personal library before. Burciaga's stories, wit, and writing style convey his intelligence and compassion and make him someone you just want to listen to and learn from. This is a great book, and I know it's going to be a great class. I look forward to the many readings that will come from Burciaga's wonderful writings. This is an interesting student because she is, at least ostensibly, a white student. She's actually taking my class, which is an online class, even though she's at the end of her bachelor's degree requirements. So she's a senior, essentially. And so for her to say that I don't think I've ever had a required reading before that I've wanted to add to my personal library was very touching, I thought. And she's about to transfer into the graduate program in pharmacy at the University of Texas. And so she, this is a student who has, a pretty vast and, extensive educational background already. And what she's recognizing in this is not only Burciaga's engaging writing, but also that he builds cultural bridges. And some of the things that he talks about are kind of the two-ness of Chicanos, right? So neither Mexican nor American, but also both. And he really focuses on the both and what Mexican Americans, what Chicanos bring to each culture. And then lastly, and then this will kind of transition into thinking about how to integrate curricula across the various courses in the program. And this is Lorian Guerrero's A Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying. She's a poet from San Antonio, and one of the YouTube videos that I really enjoy and that I know other faculty in the program have used in their classes is her TEDx San Antonio talk, What I Learned from My City. So again, this is another really interesting way to get students thinking about what their city offers, and again, regardless of cultural background, the city, the place, right? Places are always so rich with contributions to the experiences, to students' experiences, which means that there are ways in which the students can create projects, can write, can create like cajita projects and things like that. So there's the link to that. And what I will do is I will send an email out to all of the attendees with my PowerPoint presentation, since I wasn't able to upload it to the handouts, so you can get this link. And again, so this is one of the questions that came up multiple times at the Summer Institute, and I think this is always an ongoing question, is how do we adapt our specific courses with our specific student learning outcomes and specific curriculum requirements, which are different all across the state, of course, to the Catch the Next framework. How do we adapt it to a culturally relevant curriculum? So this is actually a poem that's in the book I was just talking about, Lorian Guerrero's Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying. And it's titled Ancient Algebra. This is a poem that I've often taught in my literature classes. So you can see here that she is using some logic symbols and some math symbols. I would say they go beyond algebra, but yeah, I would say they do. Some of them seem a little calculus-y to me. But it's ancient algebra. But it's also all about identity. So danger minus, quote, brain equals me. The three dots mean therefore, and that, of course, is the symbol for female. Therefore, female plus brain equals dangerous. X times bone meal plus modulation equals silence, where X equals fire and feminine. And then here we have this logic problem, which comes from kind of an equation. If X equals fire and feminine, then X times danger to the power of degradation equals quest for brain. Conquest plus cotton plus cactus minus brain is less than or equal to feminine. God plus milk plus eyes minus silence is greater than or equal to man. Here we get the first usage of the symbol for male. And then this formula, I think it's a function, is because it has the brackets. So quest for brain times infinity equals deprivation. And I'm just going to stop there with that first stanza. So when we were working with the math folks, we showed them this poem, and some of the things, so again, I think this is a excellent example of how you can incorporate a text um, that students might not understand, but it relates to women and womanhood. And kind of the story behind this poem is that she was told, Guerrero was told that as a woman, she didn't need to study math, and as a Latina, she would never use it, right? So, or she didn't have a brain, right? And so, um, that inspired her to write this poem. So some of the things we talked about is the fact that, you know, this is I think, a clear demonstration of how math can have a tone, right? How the language of math can have a tone because it does come across as very angry. Um, and, but it's also a way to test not only poetic literacy and literary literacy, but also math literacy. Because in order to understand what the poem is saying, you have to know what the little brackets mean. You have to know the less than or equal to symbol or the greater than or equal to symbol. That has to be clear. A little bit lower in the second stanza, you'll see the square root symbol, infinity, all of those. And so a lot of these are symbols that students are encountering maybe for the first time, maybe again, but that they're having to recognize as another language. And because literacy as well as contextualization is something that we want to incorporate into the math classes and into the math curriculum as we expand into the Mathways project, we were talking about using this. It can be introduced either in the learning frameworks class, in the English class, or in the math class, and having an integrated assignment where students write a poem using the math language that they're learning in their math classes, but write it as a poem about their own identity, right? So it would still be an algebraic poem, but about their own identity. So again, that would be a way, because in order to write the poem and to communicate the meaning that they intend to communicate, they have to know what the math terms are, right? What the math symbols mean. So this is something that I'm really excited about pursuing, and I just wanted to offer it here as one way to integrate across the curriculum. So another thing to think about with both math and the learning frameworks, and I have to admit this is not a book that I've read, but it's one that was recommended by one of our math faculty who attended the Institute last week, is Joe Bowler's Mathematical Mindsets, Unlocking Students' Potential Through Creative Math, Inspiring Messages, and Innovative Teaching. I know that many of us already use Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset and fixed mindset alongside Angela Duckworth's work on grit, or what many of us call ganas for our students. And so I think this is another way that I know, I've worked with my own learning frameworks partner in thinking about this in the English class, but so this is another way to think about how mindset contributes to student success in math as well. And then just one final way of thinking about how you can integrate materials across the curriculum. A couple of institutes ago, I believe it was Allegra, showed a clip from the HBO documentary, The Latino List, and it was the clip featuring NASA astronaut Jose Hernandez. Hernandez has a really interesting story. He grew up as a migrant farm worker, and his parents always, encouraged him to recognize the value of education. And so he says in that clip from the Latino List that he couldn't speak very good English, but that for him, math was a universal language. And I've always found that very interesting. I don't doubt that was the case for him, but I think it would be an interesting writing prompt to work on with our students. And again, this is something that could be done in the math class in a journal, right? A journal entry. One of the things we talked about in terms of integrating literacy into the math classes was journaling as a practice. And so maybe just showing that short clip, the clip could even be shown in the Learning Frameworks class, and asking students, do you find math to be a universal language? Is this idea true for you? Why or why not? And then again, that way you have a sense from the students themselves of their prior experience with math as a language, and how comfortable they are with it or how uncomfortable they are with it. There's also a great website, and this link is to a Maria Hinojosa interview with Jose Hernandez, where the focus of this one is less on math and more on how he developed his dream, right? So it's this idea of going from a farm worker to space. What I do like about the Latino list one, though, is he talks about the number of times he took the test and failed, sometimes just by the smallest of margins, to become a NASA astronaut. And so it also is a demonstration of grit and ganas, right? And then also, because I realized that I didn't have any women represented except for the ancient algebra. But with the math stars or with the STEM stars, there's also, if you Google Latinos in space, again, it's a Maria Hinojosa piece, and it also features Ellen Ochoa, who is also a NASA astronaut. So I think, again, in terms of integrating materials across the curriculum, one text that you could use that's also about migrant labor and migrant farm labor, as well as kind of coming into a sense of identity, and the lead character recognizes his own subjectivity, is Tomás Rivera's Y no se lo tragó la tierra, and the earth did not devour him. I think these would be excellent partnering materials across learning frameworks, English, and math curriculum. So that does it for my presentation, but I know we have some veteran faculty here with us, veteran dream catchers here with us, and so I want to open it up and hear what other materials you use in your own classes, what questions you have, what suggestions you have for contextualizing the curriculum or making a culturally relevant curriculum. So I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Oh, and Dr. Chavez pointed out, yes, of course, we now have hidden figures. I say now, but hidden figures now is in the popular consciousness and the popular awareness, and so that, of course, is another opportunity to introduce women and specifically African American women into the context of math study. Dr. Chavez. Dr. Chavez, I think you're unmuted. Do you want to go ahead and make that suggestion?
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I was thinking, too, that the movie Stand and Deliver with Almost could be a wonderful movie to show to the math students and to students in general, because it highlights how one group of students was stereotyped. It connects to the Vivaldi book that you mentioned. The assumption is that because they belong to a certain high school, they could have not done as well as they did on their SAT exam. And therefore, all of the students were required to take the test all over again. And this is definitely a true story, is one that I was partially connected to indirectly, in that some of those students had wanted to apply to Yale and were excellent candidates, but their scores were not finalized by the College Board until the last minute. And it basically can serve as a motivational movie, I think, for all students, but in particular for people in math.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Are there any other questions or suggestions? Yes, Alejandra. There we go. Okay, Alejandra, go right ahead. Sorry about that.
Hi, Lydia. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, or hear you.
Thank you so much for your suggestions. These are going to be very helpful, and we needed those suggestions of books and how to incorporate these elements in our classes, especially for the math department. And a suggestion that I have it's a movie called the title of the movie is Spare Parts. It,
Mm,
it's based on something that happened. You know, it's a real life experience. It's about four Hispanic high school students that form a robotics club in Arizona in a high school, and with no experience, $800, and use car parts in a dream, they compete in a robotic uh, contest, and they go to MIT. And this
oh,
reality that is George Lopez, the one of the actors, Jamie Lee Curtis, and some other actors. But is based on reality and how like these students had a lot of knowledge in mechanics, and this reminds me a lot of the some of the things that mentioned Dr. Laura Rendon about what we consider disadvantages can be attributes or virtues. For example, these students, they had a big talent on mechanics, that auto mechanics, and so they use that knowledge and apply
yeah.
it to a robot. And this is a wonderful movie. And there also math professors can include it in, you know, as a, I'm thinking in doing an activity with that movie, Spare Parts.